What time is it in Africa?
Different times, Ben. Just hang on. You will hear me saying it. Okay. Sorry. I think it's past midnight. Sorry. Past midnight. Okay. All right. I don't think I'm gonna wait for people to tune in because it takes a little while for people to connect with my YouTube somehow. So
there aren't many there, will there?
There are some people who are like what do you call that animal that kind of like stays awake all night? you know that animal that stays awake all night, yeah. So
Possum.
we do,
and
it's a bird.
Owls. I mean, bats.
Is it not owl?
Owls, bats.
Oh, yeah, no, bats are in China. We don't do bats. Okay. Yeah. Owls, I think they are. Okay, let me just do this. Control-C. You stay in there, Ben. Just stay in there. Stay in there. Stay in there. Right in there. I got you. Stay right there. All right. Okay. So, all right. I've got Ben Harris here. I think, Ben, I'm not sure what's going on with my YouTube, but that's fine. But anyway, guys, good morning to those in New Zealand. And I know it's morning as well in Africa, in Zimbabwe. So right now, I just really want to say welcome. I decided to do this here on YouTube broadcast, but for those who are on Facebook, I can hear myself in the background somewhere. Okay, so I've got Ben Harris here, medical microbiologist and scientist, and infection prevention and control consultant. He is going to share with us just a few things about like what we can do about COVID-19 and just these simple things that we need to be aware of about this COVID-19. Ben, introduce yourself and just say hello to people whilst I sort a few things here.
Thank you very much, Katina, and for inviting me onto your broadcast. I feel privileged. I'm speaking from New Zealand, and hello, Africa, and anyone in New Zealand as well. I intend to talk on COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 and give some useful advice, especially for healthcare institutions, but they also apply to individuals, and perhaps dispel some myths, but give some practical advice on what can be done as well. So the summary is on that first slide, but we'll go into some of that a bit more. And there's please email any questions through to Katina, who's also, for those of you that didn't know, your host tonight or this morning. Katina is a registered nurse. She has a master's with honours degree as well, infection control, and she does lots of consultancy work from infection prevention and control in New Zealand, as well as her marathon running and many other attributes too, I might add. However, to start the talk on COVID going, one of the first things is knowledge is an antidote to fear. Knowledge is an antidote to fear. So we tend not to fear nearly as much those things we do know about, and we're a lot more frightened about new things about which we don't know nearly so much about.
Ben, sorry,
yes.
I'm going to disturb you a little bit, if that's okay.
Of course.
Just give me a second, please. I'm not sure. I can hear like some sound in the background. Give me a second. I'm not sure.
Has that gone? Has that gone?
Hang on.
Sound in the background?
Okay, hang on. Let me.
6 degrees outside in Christchurch, New Zealand at the moment. I've just turned the heater off.
All right. I'll let you do this. I'll just let you carry on and finish this one. And if you don't mind, I might have to host this same thing again in another platform, but just carry on. It's all good.
Okay. So back on again. So the more we know about something, somehow we can factor in and know what a course in the future will be, and that helps reduce fear. So one of the things I wish to start on slide is that the majority of COVID infections are mild. In actual fact, the majority of COVID infections, we have no symptoms at all. They're called asymptomatic. So people develop, get an infection, and between 20 and 60 out of 100 people that catch COVID virus never develop symptoms and or do not have symptoms at the moment. Then of those that do develop symptoms, 80% of them, 80 out of 100, are just mild. And by mild, that may be a slightly runny nose, for instance, or feeling just a little bit off color, not one of your better days, or maybe just a touch of diarrhea. They can also be a mild cough and such like, but 80 out of 100 are that mild. But you are infectious even when they're very mild, or even when you don't know you're carrying it and you have no symptoms at all. Then a bit over 10 per 100 people who have symptoms may have more severe symptoms. And one of the more main ones, and there's a whole range of symptoms for COVID, one of the more main ones, other than fever, having a temperature, and a cough, is difficulty breathing, really quite difficulty breathing. But only a very small number, maybe 5 out of 100, is the person in a critical condition, only 5 out of 100. And those that have the critical condition, they mainly belong to the over 63-year-olds. On the right-hand side of the screen here, on the orange, yellow-orange bars, the majority of people ultimately who die are in the over 60-year-olds, and you can see how that increases dramatically in the 70 to 79-year-olds and 80 plus year olds. Just remember, most people that die of COVID would have died anyway within the next 12 months. Would have died anyway within the next 12 months. This is on a percentage basis. Most would have died in the next 12 months of their other underlying health conditions. They're often called comorbid conditions. So that may in particular be heart condition, or diabetes, sugar diabetes, or respiratory coughing type diseases, or high blood pressure, or various cancers. So only a very small number, less than 1 in 100, who are over that 63-year-old will die without any underlying health conditions. It's really important to know that. And that's somewhat the same as influenza. When we die of influenza, it is not necessarily of influenza that we die, and it's primarily the elderly that die of influenza. They usually die with influenza and a number of other underlying significant illnesses. And that's the same with COVID as well. So we must keep that perspective very clearly in mind. As far as outbreaks go, any outbreak, whether it's COVID or anything else, we try and confirm that there is an outbreak, in fact, going on. Because when there's fear going on, most people that have snivelly noses or a bit of a cough, it will not be COVID. Most people, it'll be something else. But when an outbreak comes, if there is testing available, we can tell when it is likely to be COVID, because we know there's lots of cases exist where there are tests available, if they're available in your area, to be able to do it. Then we try and implement control and prevention measures. We notify people. If you're in a healthcare institution, notify people. The case definition is a fancy word for have they got a temperature, do they have a cough, are they having difficulty breathing, etc. And as I've said, we try and confirm what it's there. When it's an institution we're talking about, The case line listing is a fancy word for making a map of your facility, whether it's a rest home or larger institution, hospital. And on that map, sketch a map, where are the cases? So we try and confirm whether at the far end of a corridor or the near end, what are the common, is there one person that's been to both those areas that may have spread it, to them? So that's the epidemiology. How did they get spread there? And then keep the communication going. Communication when there is an outbreak is absolutely essential. Talking or communication are absolutely essential, because without communication, which is what we're doing now, we don't understand what's going on, and that's really, really frightening. So by talking to people and letting them know what you do know and what you do know helps reduce the fear. And I re-emphasize, the vast majority of people under 63-year-olds that catch it, in percentage terms, will never ever die of it. Now, we have to be careful the difference between percentage and absolute numbers. So you may see on television or something else, here's 3 children that have died of it, and you think, wow, children can die of it. But was it 3 in 1,000 children that died of it, or 3 in 100,000? So if it's 3 in 100,000, that's a tiny percentage. It's never nice, but in percentage terms, it's tiny. And if you are somebody looks up to you because of your knowledge, and you're a healthcare worker, for instance, say what you do know, and also say what you do not know. It's very powerful to get utter integrity and honesty going with that. And boots on the ground, as I call it, is also really important. Walk around, talk to people, listen to their fears, and develop a trust, so then they can be more effective in controlling it. Rumors are very, very powerful, and they tend to spread faster than truths. So be there. If you're in a community of healthcare workers or other people in a village or otherwise in a town, try and talk as much as possible and spread the word of why you shouldn't necessarily be frightened. Do what you do know works, and that is primarily personal protective equipment, especially masks and hand hygiene. They're the 2 key most important things. Watch, 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 observe, 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 and show me, show me, show me. How do you do this? What do you do this? If it's a rest home, watch for their practices. Watch people's hand hygiene, watch the environment, cleaning and disinfection, and try and reduce visitors as much as possible if we're in a healthcare facility, and look after the workers, the employees' risks. For instance, there may be a culture, go to work, no matter how ill you are, it's good to go to work, but that is not. If somebody is ill, we have to make judgments. If we're swamped, it's better to have people going to work who have illness that don't. But long before that happens, we don't want anyone that's slightly ill to go to work if we've got enough staff to back up. Then keep communicating throughout any outbreak, both in writing and talking, and keep updating that regularly as we go on. Here's another perspective again. See, above that, which I haven't got on that graph, is many people, a significant number, maybe 20 to 60 out of 100, that catch COVID infection have absolutely no symptoms whatsoever. That's really important to know, because even if you have no symptoms, say you're at work in a healthcare facility, even if you have no symptoms, you may have the infection. And with COVID, when you have the infection, with or without symptoms, you can pass it on to others. So really remember that. So masks and good hand hygiene stay really important to keep doing. Notice the mild and moderate, they nearly all recover, mild and moderate infections. It's only the small number of severe and critical infections that can end up dying. And once again, in perspective, most of those are over 63-year-olds in terms of percentage. Most are over 63, and the vast majority have a significant underlying illness on top of that as well. So some of the symptoms, without symptoms or asymptomatic, up the top there is somebody that has no symptoms at all, but if you had a swab test available, the swab may well be positive. So no symptoms, but the swab test may well be positive if a swab test was available. Then the mild symptoms, I've just underlined ones that you may not think about: bit of fatigue, bit of a sore throat, bit of a runny nose, the odd sneeze, maybe a bit of diarrhea. Those can all be symptoms of COVID. Now, in perspective, most people with a sore throat do not have COVID, but when there's lots of COVID about, that may be the only sign you have. Then the moderate symptoms, we have the pneumonias, and may well have a temperature or fever, and low oxygen, etc. And CT scans or radiology X-ray scans can show up if that was available, and that's only in hospitals. Then gets severe right through to critical infections, and that's when things are a lot worse. I tend to look at risk, especially in institutions, but this works in the community as well, from the perspective of Swiss cheese. I'm not sure how many are familiar with the Swiss cheese with holes in it, but Swiss cheese has holes in it, which is actually made. You think, how do the holes get there? Because the microbes, the bacteria in the cheese making process, they produce carbon dioxide bubbles. And when there's lots of bacteria in there, the bubbles come together, and it's a bit like a Coca-Cola or some such thing. When we take the top off, there's whole lots of bubbles. That's the same in the Swiss cheese when it's made. And when we cut that Swiss cheese into slices, then almost never will all those holes line up. So you can look from one end and look all the way through to the other. However, it is only when we have a system in place to try and reduce the hazards or risks, either in a home, at home, or more importantly, in a rest home or in a hospital. It's only when all those risk features at each one of those points, and I'll expand on this shortly, each one of those points, we can never eliminate risk at each step of the way. We can only greatly reduce it. And we all play a part in that, and there's a system approach to that. It's only when that risk is minimized do we greatly, at each one of the stages, do we greatly minimize the chances of COVID getting through them all. So, for instance, and we're all responsible for this risk, if we know there's COVID cases in the community, there might be a regional outbreak, so we know the cases are there. We primarily get COVID by sharing the air, the breathed air of others that have it. So the longer we spend with people that have a cough or have COVID infection, then the more likely we are to pick it up ourselves. It will be unusual for anyone to develop an infection from somebody else within 30 seconds or so. The longer we spend with them, say more than a quarter of an hour, that significantly increases our chances of catching COVID ourselves and so being able to pass it on to others. So when we know COVID's in the community, that's why we try and limit larger gatherings, because it's more likely to spread faster in the community when the people from the gatherings then go home either to their communities or to their houses. Around 80 out of 100 COVID infections come from people within families within their house. So there's the start, up the right-hand end. Home and friends, that's the first lot of holes. We can minimize that by not spending so much time in communities when we know there's COVID in the community. And that community may be at home, or the community may be in a healthcare facility. Then we have education around it, which is what we're doing now. How do we minimize this? And there's management with that. How do we set up protocols? And then further down the line, we have PPE, personal protective equipment, which may be masks and gowns. And then if all of those steps and the Swiss cheese fail up to then, only then are we likely to be able to pass it on to others. Once again, looking at the same thing again, the green circles are prevention. And so we've got the hazard, it's in the community. And if we don't spend so much time in large gatherings, and that's the first stage, the engineering control, if you like, that's the first stage of prevention, not spending time, and or if someone at home develops a cough, isolating them to their room. Then in a facility, we have administrative controls, which is maybe management, setting up processes, but knowing when you come to work, do you have a temperature, do you have a cough, do you have a runny nose? So having those, that reduces risks if it's done properly. We can never eliminate them, but we can reduce them. We can't eliminate them because somebody may have COVID infection, but have no symptoms at all. Then there's the behavioral prevention. Are we doing what we should do? Are we wearing a mask when we should do? Are we doing hand hygiene when we should do? If a case of COVID slips through all those holes, only then do we have an incident. And somebody, a patient or a person develops COVID, and then we start the mitigation barriers, and that is extra attention to isolation, and the masks, and the hand hygiene when we're attending that person with it. And that's to lessen the impact and further spread again of anything going on. To understand risk, we also need to understand, I often ask people, are there good bugs and are there bad bugs? Is it clear there are good bugs and bad bugs? And most people say, yes, of course. And in medical audiences, I ask the same question, are there good bugs, are there bad bugs? And everyone says yes. And I say, you're all wrong when they say yes. Clearly, they're partially right. But I wish to explain this principle a little bit more. It's a thing called an infectious dose. Every different species or type of microbe, whether it's COVID or TB, or I'll say the bacteria in milk, every different species has an infection dose number, or the number of that bacteria or the number of that virus above which the average person will succumb to infection and develop infection, below which the average person will not develop any illness or infection. So if you have pasteurized milk, then we know it is not sterile. It's only ever designed, pasteurization was only ever designed to kill one type of bacteria, and that's TB. Sometimes TB can come from animals, and it does that very well. So it's only heated to about 70 to 72 degrees, pasteurized milk, and that we can drink. And in fact, that is good, because when we drink pasteurized milk, then the bacteria in it, they're below the infectious dose number, or the number required to cause infection. And when we drink those bacteria, it keeps our immune system match fit. And they go along and they neutralize those bacteria, and we do not have any illness at all. So for old milk, there needs to be more than about 1 million per mil, more than 10 to the power of 6 or 1 million per mil before the average person will succumb. Less than that, and we slow it down when we keep it in the fridge, the average person, those bugs will not cause any trouble. For salmonella food poisoning, which may come from chickens or animals, salmonella food poisoning, the average person, it's a bacteria, needs to ingest more than about 1,000 bacteria before they're likely to get diarrhea and or vomiting. More than 1,000. Less than 1,000, and the average person will not know they've ingested salmonella, and our immune system will neutralize those salmonella, and we may develop some immunity to it as well, to that particular strain. Seasonal influenza, the average person needs to breathe in more than 800 influenza virus before they're likely to come down with influenza. Less than 800, and once again, they get what's called a subclinical or an underclinical infection, and they'll have no symptoms at all, but they'll develop immunity to the seasonal influenza. It's only when the average person breathes in more than 800 that they develop it. Campylobacter infection, similarly, 500 the infectious dose. Boils and such like, with Staphylococcus aureus, we need more than about 200. For norovirus, we only need to ingest or eat or breathe in 10 to 20 norovirus before the average person will get vomiting and or diarrhea. 10 to 20 norovirus only. Bearing in mind that when somebody has norovirus, vomiting and diarrhea, or gastroenteritis, the source, the feces or the vomit, has around 1,000 million virus per tiny wee mil or tiny wee gram. 1,000 million virus, a vast number. So dare I say it, if it's steaming because it's fresh, we only need, from that 1,000 million source per tiny wee gram or mil, we only need to breathe in or eat 10 to 20 to get ill. Measles infection, we only need to breathe in between 3 and 10 virus. That's infectious dose, 3 to 10 virus before we get ill, which is why it's so unbelievably infectious. Now, the difference between measles and norovirus is we can vaccinate for measles, and hopefully everybody does, so then they will not catch measles. Measles vaccination lasts for life. Measles vaccination lasts for life. So to get measles vaccination, 2 shots, that lasts for life, and it reduces your chances of developing measles 98%. Unfortunately for norovirus, there is no vaccination. And unfortunately, when we catch norovirus, the immunity we get from it, unlike measles, which lasts for life, the immunity from norovirus only lasts about 4 to 6 weeks. Then it's gone again, and we're just as vulnerable again. Now, we don't know what the infectious dose is for COVID-19 because it would be unethical to have volunteers to see how many viruses we have to give them and then find out that the group that we're giving them more than the infectious dose, some of them died. That would be unethical to do a trial like that, so we can't do it. But we assume it's likely that influenza at 800, we know it's likely to be, and this is a guess only, COVID infectious dose number is likely to be, say, 100 or perhaps 200 virus, 100 to 200 virus, but we don't know for that. With any
sorry, Ben, can I just interrupt a little bit? Can you just emphasize more on the COVID one? I mean, all those other ones, I know they are quite important, but the one thing that people are really anxious about at the moment is the COVID one. So if you can just go back to that one more time to tell us the infectious rate for COVID-19, what is it, or what are they estimating it? Because I know it's not quite specific yet, but
okay. So this is, thank you, no trouble at all, interrupt whenever you wish. I think I want to put this in perspective, that influenza, to get the 800 virus, generally that's within 1 to 2 meters or 6 feet or so within somebody coughing to get influenza. 1 to 2 meters is the main risk zone. COVID is going to be, it seems, within 1 to 2 meters, people will catch it very, very easily. And we probably only need to breathe in, and I'm guessing 1 to 200 COVID virus. So it's a lot easier to catch. We have an idea of COVID by looking at what's called the rho value, the R naught or transmission value of COVID. Whenever any infection or epidemic, I should say, or outbreak, the R naught value is when somebody is ill with an infection, on average, how many more people do they pass it on to? So if you're ill and the average person who is ill with influenza, say they pass it on to 2 other people, then the epidemic will keep growing because the 2 that have caught it in turn will pass it on to 2 more. So we go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. So when the R naught or the average transmission is more than 1, the epidemic grows. So clearly COVID has rocketed around the world, so it's a lot more than 1. When the R naught is less than 1, the average person with it will pass it on to less than 1 people, to 1 other person. And so the epidemic comes to an end, which is what happens with seasonal influenza. So the R naught value informs us a lot about how infectious COVID is. So when a population is not immune, when they're not immune, the average person with measles passes it on to 12 to 18 other people if they're not immune. So the R naught is 12 to 18. With what's called the Spanish influenza, then the average person with the Spanish influenza pandemic passed it on to 2 to 3 other people. Ebola down the bottom is 1 to 2 people. Seasonal influenza, the R naught's about 1.5. The average person with seasonal influenza passes it on to 1.5 others.
Mm.
We're not certain the rho value, the R naught value for COVID, because it's only been in humans for 7 months or so. But the different studies, here's the R naught values on the left, and the different studies have come up with different values, but it may be around 2.5 to 3.5 people. Some are saying around 7, some more like 2, but it's likely to be 2.5 to 3 other people the average person with COVID passes it on to. That's really quite an infection when it's an airborne transmission. Remembering HIV infection is only passed on by sexual transmission, whereas when something's passed on by respiratory, then it's a lot harder to combat it in a public place. You're not going to pass on HIV in a public gathering, but you are going to pass on COVID. On average, somebody with COVID, after say 15 minutes to half an hour, if they have COVID infection with or without symptoms, it's generally believed that average person after about 15 minutes will pass it on to 2.5 to 3.5 other people.
Wow. Okay, so that's quite an interesting fact right there, Ben, because I mean, you are comparing COVID-19 with some of the diseases that we've had in the past, like which were known as like some. Okay, you spoke about I think HIV, and obviously, if I haven't been in contact with anyone sexually, my chances of getting it, other than needle prick injuries from work and all the other stuff, are very low. And you compare it with measles, and I'm thinking, okay, so COVID-19 is something like I can just walk out there. I know in New Zealand we don't have any cases at the moment, but just looking at that alone, it's quite interesting, Ben. It's quite interesting.
That's right. It's fascinating because those ones I've gone back to the R naught. When we look at the middle, the transmission lines, we can see polio, which is almost wiped out from the earth. That's going to be the feces, oral, which may be contaminated water. HIV is only sexual contact. So in the ideal world, someone knows what they can do to stop HIV/AIDS. You either wear protection or ultimately abstinence, don't have sex, but that's the only way it can be passed over. Needle stick is relatively uncommon because we need quite a high infectious dose of the virus, and so that's why it requires sexual contact and with time to pass it on, whereas needle stick, although it can happen, it's a lot less common. It's primarily sexual contact. But influenza and COVID and measles are respiratory, airborne respiratory, and so we have to reduce sharing air with others who may or may not have symptoms, but nevertheless be carrying COVID, that we have to do. That's the key point.
Right. There's a question for you right here before you go to your next slide, Ben.
Yes.
So I've got Brochbog on there. I don't know if you can see the questions.
No, I can't. I can only see my slides. Yes. So,
okay,
read out the question, please.
Okay, so it says that's Brochbog, and then I know hi Broch, she's in the UK. She's saying, Ben, is it true that if you have if you have a flu jab, you might be high risk to have COVID? Not sure which strain though. So she's asking that if you have, or if you've had a flu jab, you might be at high risk of getting COVID, but not sure which strain vaccine. So you might
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I'll try the best I can. I don't think there's always different papers and different thoughts and rumors. Are you more susceptible to catching COVID because you've had an influenza vaccination? And I think the balance of opinion is definitely not. Definitely not. I think there are people that there are more people than originally thought that have caught COVID and influenza at the same time. So there are a number of people, it's interesting, that have got two infections at the same time. But I don't think there's any credible evidence to show that getting influenza vaccine increases you at all to COVID-19. And at the moment on published data, and it's increasing, I would completely discredit that. It was something that came up at one stage. This may be possible, but I think it is very, very unlikely. An important other message underlying is that by having influenza vaccine, and I have to point out influenza is also an RNA virus, but having influenza vaccine or vaccination, excuse me, only reduces the average under 60-year-olds' chances of catching influenza by about 60 to 70%. Nowhere near as good as the measles vaccine, which is 98%, 97, 98%. In the average year, influenza vaccine only reduces under 6-year-olds' chances of catching influenza by 60 to 70%. Influenza vaccine only reduces over 65-year-olds' chances of getting influenza by, in an average year, about 20%. So actually, it is not that good, or not that, it's not very effective as a vaccine. But if under 60-year-olds or under 65-year-olds with influenza, who it's actually really quite, it does happen, but it's relatively rare for them to die. Under 60-year-olds, where the vaccine works best, if they can reduce their chances by 2/3 of catching influenza, they in turn reduce their chances by 2/3 of passing it on to over 65-year-olds who are much more likely to catch it and die from it. So in many ways, the influenza vaccination in practice, it reduces our own chances of catching it, but we help safeguard those most at risk. Now, when COVID is about, we want to do everything we can to keep the hospitals as empty as we can so we can treat any COVID patients that come along. So an added benefit of having influenza vaccination is we're not needlessly filling up hospitals or healthcare situations with people that happen to have influenza who may well not be there if they've been vaccinated. But we don't have that luxury with COVID. So we want to keep as many people, we want to reduce influenza as much as practically possible. So we've got healthcare centers still available for treating COVID-19 patients.
Okay.
And we hope when a COVID vaccine comes along, the big question is, how effective is it? Is it going to be like an influenza one, 20 to 60%?
Yeah.
Or is it going to be like a measles one, 98%?
Yeah.
And how long is it effective for? Is it going to be for a year? Or is it going to be for life, like measles? Or a year, like influenza? And do we need 2 doses of it, like measles? And how safe is it? All those questions are going to be really important. Sorry, you were going to say something.
That's fine. I think we're going to have that discussion at some point, because I'm hearing myself in somebody's background. Did you turn on one of your devices on again?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. Okay. It seems to come and go. All right. There seem to be some echoes somewhere. So anyway, that was broad. She says, really, thank you. That was quite interesting. And she has asked another question before you move on. I think let's just get.
No trouble at all. Happy to hear them.
You spoke about you know, how you were talking about the infectious rates and everything. And I think now she's asking this question as well. Are people with HIV high risk of COVID-19? Just remember, Ben, most of the people that we're going to be talking to, and we're going to do this again on Facebook for those who are watching, but they are from Africa. And, you know, we've got the highest rates of HIV in Africa, other than, of course, in New Zealand, we know we've got it on the homosexuals and stuff like that. But in Africa, it's actually our daily bread over there. So they just want to know, like, is it true that people with HIV are high risk of COVID-19?
On the data that I've seen so far, they do not seem to be at increased risk of COVID-19. It is interesting. Normally, and HIV reduces our immunity. HIV reduces our immunity, so we then become predisposed to catching more infections that we wouldn't normally catch. And so these very low pathogenic infections like pneumonia there's a parasite called Pneumocystis carinii. People catch that, which is not normally pathogenic for people, but when they have HIV, their immune system is lower, and that can cause infections, by way of example. Generally, when our immunity is lower, clearly we're more likely to catch infections. COVID-19 seems to be different, and we're still learning about it. Any infection, this is really key, any infection we have, it's not the infection that causes us humans the problem in itself. It's our immune response to that particular infection. It's our immune response, which is the symptoms. So by that I mean, if you have a cut finger, a cut on your finger or a wound, the bacteria would normally be Staphylococcus aureus, for instance, or Staph aureus. That in itself can be there in billions, but that is not the trouble in itself. It's our immune response to the bacteria, which the immune response coming to get rid of it. So our blood vessels swell and we have a temperature, which is all part of the process, and white cells go to the site because the blood vessels are now more swollen. That's our immunity. And we get a temperature and we get pus. All of that is our immune response, which is sent there to get rid of the bacteria. The bacteria in themselves are not the trouble. They're the instigator of our immune system, and that immune system, the temperature, the swelling, the heat, the pus, is our immune response. That's what happens with most infections. We get a significant immune response. Even more so with COVID. We seem to almost have a hypersensitivity immune response with COVID. So we get a little bit of COVID and suddenly we get an extreme respiratory response. What is interesting is, in general, there's some tilting, if you like, to people that are immunocompromised not having as bad a symptoms as those that are not immunocompromised. So some people with a reduced immune system seem to be a little bit less likely to get severe symptoms than those people that have either a normal immune system or even an immune system tilted to more inflammatory responses. And as we get older, we get more inflammatory responses. So we more routinely, to the person in the UK, they may well know, and those in Africa may know, as we get older, for instance, the dipsticks, urinary dipstick results in our bladder, we're more likely to have white cells in our bladder, even without any symptoms at all. We have more inflammatory responses. Diabetes, blood pressure, we have inflammatory responses, and they're like pro-inflammatory. So those people with inflammation markers, they're more likely to get more severe COVID-19. And HIV would actually be less immune system, and if anything, less immune response. It's a little bit counterintuitive. Any other questions at this stage?
I cannot see any, but I think they are satisfied with your response for now. Why am I can hear myself in the background.
I can hear you a little bit in the background too, but no trouble.
Okay.
We'll move on then.
Yeah, you can move on.
Oh, masks. What do they stop? How good are they? What do they stop? You can have a homemade, do-it-yourself one made out of cotton on the left. You can have, that's the cheapest of the lot, of course. You've made it yourself. You have a surgical mask, which is still pretty cheap. And then you can have a much more expensive N95 respirator mask, but they are expensive. They are expensive. And they all have value. They all help reduce the chances. That Swiss cheese holes model, they all help reduce the chances. So if you're completely isolated from sharing air of others, then you're not going to need a mask. It's only when you're sharing air, the respirator mask of others that have COVID, that you're more likely to get it. And then the different types of masks work better, depending on the quality of them. So I use this next slide as an example. On the left, we have a person coughing, and out comes large droplets. And also there's a range when someone's coughing and or sneezing, from large droplets right down to water vapor and tiny wee particles. So like a cricket ball, for instance, or perhaps a soccer ball. When the larger the object, in general, the more dense it is, and the further it can be thrown when we cough. It can go to the other side of the room when it's large. Also, if it hasn't been propelled very fast, it may just drop down to the ground within 1 to 2 meters. Then the smaller droplets or the water vapor can't be propelled so far, but like steam or like smoke, I often like to use as an example, it can meander its way quite happily, just float its way rather than being thrown. It can float its way to the other side of the room, just like smoke. Now, when we put a mask in front of us, no matter what that mask is, when we're coughing, say it's made out of a cotton homemade mask, that's going to stop all the large droplets. So they're not going to go to the far side of the room, including if there are people at the far side. Depending on the quality of the mask will be how many of the smaller droplets will be right down to the tiny, tiny ones. How many of those will be filtered by the mask? And also, you'll see in my diagram there, if the mask is tight-fitting, top and bottom, then those particles above and below the mask that I've got sitting out there, if it's not tight-fitting, more of those particles will be able to zip around the edges of the mask. When we push them down tight-fitting, more of them will get caught up in the mask. Also note that that mask, I've put all those droplets on there, the red droplets, we don't see those. One of the troubles with microbes in general, including COVID, is we cannot see them. And as humans, we tend to be hardwired emotionally to responding things we can see. So what I'm saying is the mask that you put on, no matter what it is, homemade or N95 or surgical mask, it will look exactly the same when you put it on as when you take it off. But if you've had contact with somebody with influenza or COVID, that mask, if it's working well, will be covered with virus, with pathogens. We can't see that, but we have to take it off very carefully. And I use the expression, a little bit vulgar though it may be, treat that mask with total respect, as though it is covered with feces. And if it was covered with feces, you would go, that's absolutely disgusting and take it off very carefully and dispose of it very carefully. The only difference is COVID is much worse than if it was covered with feces and you cannot see the COVID. So treat it with utter respect when you take it off. Do not touch it when you're wearing it, and wash your hands, do hand hygiene, either alcohol or liquid soap and water when you have taken it off. That's that key message. Now, near the window that I've got on that slide, just imagine that person that's coughing is smoking, just by way of example. There'll be less smoke particles at the far side of the room. If we open an external window or an external door, that's smoke by way of surrogate, and or, of course, viruses, COVID or influenza virus. The air will be diluted more if that window was open externally or a door was open. And that in turn, if you were standing at the far side of the room, that wouldn't reduce the numbers of virus that you could breathe in, or the amount of smoke or virus you could breathe in. So you'd have to be at the far side of the room for much longer to, for instance, breathe in that 100 or 200, whatever it may be, infectious dose number before you caught COVID. So increasing time breathing air in increase your chances of catching COVID. The more time you spend, close or distant, the more time you spend breathing the same air as somebody that had COVID, the more likely you are to get it. But the further away you are, it's not just 1 to 2 meters, the further away you are, the longer it would take to breathe enough virus to get an infection. Is that very, very clear, I hope? I've labored the point somewhat, but it's an utterly critical point.
It is to me, but to me, we will wait to see people ask questions, but yeah, keep going.
Are there any questions on that from anyone? Please keep typing them in. Katina can happily convey them on to me. Still nothing coming in? That's absolutely critical, that slide.
Yeah, keep going.
Now we move on to the structure of the COVID virus. The key part is that second one down, the spike proteins. This is the structure of the virus itself. There's various other parts with names on them you can see there, the RNA in the middle. But it's the spike protein that has to attach to something. No virus causes an infection just by itself. When it gets to a human, it has to attach something before it sets off our immune system. So those spike proteins have to attach in humans to something called an ACE2, ACE2 receptor site. So down the bottom, that's angiotensin converting enzyme 2 is a fancy word for it, but it doesn't matter. Down the bottom is a human cell with an ACE2 protein on it. And that must be there before the pink spike proteins can attach to the human cell and thus cause infection. So we have to have ACE2 proteins, and they're not in all cells. They're mainly in the respiratory tract and some in the bowel tract. And so the COVID virus can only cause infection by attaching to those sites with its spike protein. And that's why with vaccines, a lot of those are looking at how do we neutralize the spike proteins so it cannot attach to a human cell. Coming back to the masks.
Yeah.
We have somebody coughing, and as I said, the large, more dense particles go the furthest, and you can throw a cricket ball much further than you can throw a ping pong ball. So the large, more dense ones, you can't throw smoke very far at all with tiny particles, but it will waft a long way. The large particles have more virus, but even the smoke particles will also or that size particle will also carry virus. So even breathing, normal breathing, our vapor comes out with virus in it. The large droplets can also fall down in a relatively small distance if we're not coughing. So somebody on the right is coughing and setting out all these large and small droplets, and anything larger than what's called 10 microns, and many bacteria, for instance, are between 1 and 3 microns, but it doesn't matter too much about that, and COVID virus might be 0.1 to 0.01 microns, but the large droplets, 10 microns or more, get stopped or caught up in our upper respiratory tract, in the nose or upper throat. The smaller particles only go down into the lung. And the large particles, either by the person coughing, if they're wearing a mask, whether that's a tea towel or cotton one, or whether it's a surgical mask or N95, the large particles are relatively easily stopped. Anything 10 microns or larger. The small particles, or the aerosols as they're called, less than 10 microns, they do go down into the lung. And those small particles are efficiently blocked by an N95 mask, but they're in short supply around the world and they're very expensive, the N95 masks. We're talking about risk mitigation. Here we have the different types of masks. This is a little bit harder perhaps to understand, but if we use the number of 100 as a reference standard, then we can see that when there's 100 particles there and someone's coughing here, if you're wearing a tea cloth mask, then 33 out of 100 particles will get through. So Swiss cheese model, we have reduced the chances of catching an infection by 70%, because 70 of them have been caught up in the mask, only 33 out of 100 have got through. Whereas an N95 mask will reduce the chances by 100% or 99%. Only one will get through. If the person coughing was also wearing a mask, that doubles the benefit, of course. We reduce it another 70%. Or if the person was isolated and they were nowhere near the person on the left, that works even better. On the right-hand side, we have somebody coughing. Now, because there's so much pressure and the mask is just in front, it doesn't work as well. No mask works as well when the person themselves is coughing, because we've got huge force blasting through. So ideally, we want either the person with infection to be isolated and not there, or the person coughing to be wearing a mask, and when you're attending them, to wear a mask as well. Out of interest, just so you can see how this works, on the left-hand side, there's some blue bars. It's got nasopharynx, which is the nasal area. That's where the most ACE2 receptor sites are. So that's got the most places in the nose where COVID virus can attach to. So by wearing a mask, it's going to stop those large droplets. That's where the most ACE2 receptor sites are. We also have some, but smaller numbers, in the bronchus, which is the higher lung, and in the alveoli, which is the tiny, tiny wee air sacs in the lung. We still have ACE2 receptor sites there. Remembering the COVID virus has to be able to attach to an ACE2 site, otherwise it can't cause infection. So, and also we have some in the bowel too, which is why we get diarrhea sometimes with COVID virus. So that just explains why it's in the respiratory tract. The COVID virus has to be able to attach to cells that have this ACE2 receptor site, which is only mainly in the upper respiratory, but smaller numbers in the lung. So when we look at all the different mask types, like an N95 mask that they can be more difficult to breathe because they're filtering so well. So it's a lot finer particles. So some of them have a valve at the front so you can breathe out nice and easily. That's fine if you are attending somebody a patient, for instance, or somebody with COVID, you can breathe out nice and easily, but it filters all the air coming in. The downside is that if you yourself had COVID virus and did not know it because you did not have symptoms, then there is no filtration when you breathe out at all to filter any of the virus you're breathing out, even though you did not know you had COVID virus. But any mask will help, and reducing sharing the air from others that may have the virus, whether they have symptoms or not, will all reduce your chances of getting it significantly. There are little things that can be done, practical things. Here's an ordinary mask, and maybe a surgical mask, but it may be a homemade mask. If, for instance, you wrap a stocking around, then that helps hold the mask tighter to the skin on the edges, and that works even better. So we're talking about Swiss cheese, reducing the risks. And all of these, we're talking about reducing the risk. There is never a way to eliminate all risk. We're talking about reducing it, and some things reduce it a lot more than others.
I'm gonna bring you back to the masks again, Ben, because you know what? I've had the whole week since we did our last live last week. People are asking lots of questions around the mask. Is it really necessary? I'm suffocating when I'm at work. But leave that one. There's a question on the screen there for you from Mark Mazikana, and he's one of my my mates there.
Just read out, please.
He says, "Hi, Katina and Ben. Thank you for educating us on this critical issue. I've heard something about human blood types. Is it true that vulnerability to COVID-19 can differ due to your blood type?"
You're very well read. Yes, as for many infections, different blood type can have a different effect on your immunity to COVID. And it's not going to stop it. It just reduces your chances. Some blood types just reduce your chance of getting it. So it might be, I'm guessing now, I can't remember the actual figures, it may be 10% less or something like that. So it's yet another Swiss cheese mitigation factor, but you cannot change your blood type. So it's just a fact of life. You may be some blood types, you're a little bit less, but COVID's not the only infection that does that. Many infections have an association with blood type, yes. Simplified in here, vitamin D, D for deaf, the more vitamin D, well, not the more, if we have sufficient vitamin D, which we get from exposure to the sun, then there's increasing evidence, it's not absolutely certain, but there's increasing evidence to show that reduces the chances of respiratory viral infections. And we assume, although it's too soon to tell, if it specifically relates to COVID as well. Now, in general, in Africa, depending on how near the equator you are, you're going to be more exposed to sun, and so more likely to have enough sun and vitamin D. However, melanin, the darker the skin, the melanin stops the ultraviolet B rays from getting through to the skin that makes the vitamin D. So the more melanin, or the darker the skin, the less or the more sun you need to make vitamin D. The general rule of thumb, as I'm in New Zealand, as we get a lower latitude on the Earth, that's further away from the equator, in New Zealand, for instance, we do not get enough sun from spring, from autumn through to spring, to make the required amount of vitamin D. Even with fair skins, we do not make enough vitamin D. And ideally, we would take vitamin D as a supplement. the units are 1,000 international units per day. Ideally, we need about 1,000 international units a day. What I'm saying is, in the summer, we need about 10 to 15 minutes a day to get, and that will give us something like 20,000 international units, to about 10 to 15 minutes without sun cream, because sunscreen stops the UV light. So about 10 to 15 minutes only in summer to have, we actually get about 20,000 international units of vitamin D. We only need 1,000 today, and in summer that will give 20,000. In winter or autumn, spring, as you get further south in Africa, you'll need longer and longer. And if you've got darker skin, the darker the skin, the longer you need in the sun as well. The general rule of thumb is if your shadow is longer than you, then you will not be getting enough vitamin D. So that's a rough rule of thumb, over 10 to 15 minutes in the sun without sunscreen. If your shadow is longer than you, you'll either need to spend longer in the sun or take a supplement. For instance, in Mongolia, and I know you're nowhere near Mongolia, it reduced, taking vitamin D reduced respiratory infections 300% by taking vitamin D in Mongolia. So I just mentioned that too. There are many things, whether it's blood group, vitamin D, that can make a difference. Similarly, for immunity, we must never overlook the basics. Our immune system works better when we get a good night's sleep. So it does. Our immune system can be measurably better by having a good night's sleep. Our immune system is measurably better when we have good variety in our diet, especially with plant-based products, ideally up to 25 per week, even in tiny amounts, but a variety of 25 plant-based products a week. And similarly, even light to moderate exercise makes a measurable difference in our immune system's effectiveness. Those three things I add in. Never underestimate them.
I'm safe.
Any more questions?
Not at the moment. I think that was Mark right there. I'll tell you something, Ben. We're gonna get more questions when we take the this whole educational thing to Facebook, but I really needed it to just come on YouTube directly so that I don't have to keep transferring things here. So this is really good. It's actually a much better platform here. So yeah, no questions at the moment. We can go ahead.
Okay. So I've just put this up in case you see case definitions for influenza, Center for Disease Control in the United States, for instance. So you must have a fever, cough, and or sore throat. But the trouble, even that for influenza, yes, when somebody fulfills that, 7 out of 10 before COVID, 7 out of 10 would be influenza, but it misses, that case definition misses most cases of influenza. It's exactly the same with COVID. Now, this is a fancy name, it's called a Shivers study in New Zealand, but it repeats what's happened in the world. This one's Southern Hemisphere influenza vaccine efficacy research study. Most people with influenza and most people with COVID, e.g. 70%, have no symptoms at all. Arguably, everybody with COVID or everybody with influenza infection started off with no symptoms at all. Now, in practice, influenza, about 70% of people will never develop symptoms, and COVID, 20 to 60% of people will never develop symptoms. And of those that do develop symptoms, 8 out of 10 will not be severe enough to need medical help, and only the small number will need medical help. And from those that need medical help, a smaller number still go on to need hospitalization. So we cannot tell on symptoms who has COVID or not, because even a runny nose can well be COVID. So we only ever see the tip of the iceberg. And when we know COVID is in the community, because there've been reports of it or proof of it, the more cases there are, everybody is at increased risk. And the more time we spend sharing air, public places, etc., it's very unlikely to catch it walking down a street. But if you're in a shop, once again, think of walking down the street. Somebody's smoking, you don't take much of their air in. But if they walked into a shop and carried on smoking, the longer you're in that shop with that shared smoked air, the more likely you are to potentially breathe enough smoke, and the equivalent being enough virus to come down with it. I just wish to show this slide briefly. A negative swab test for COVID never rules out COVID-19.
Yeah.
A positive test is very likely to be COVID, but many cases of COVID have a negative swab test. And there's many different papers. This is one of the early ones from China. And of course, they've had the most experience. One of the early ones from China showed that bronchoalveolar lavage is a fancy word for putting a tube down into someone's lung, pouring some water or saline into the lung, sucking it out again and doing the test. That only detected 93 out of 100 COVID people known to have COVID. It missed 7 out of 100. Whereas the nasal swab, and this would apply to saliva as well, the nasal swab, that only detected 63 out of 100 known cases. Now, other studies have shown a bit better than this, but what I'm saying is if the virus was only in the lung, for instance, not in the upper respiratory tract, then the swab was going to be negative. So just bear in mind, a negative swab never ever rules out COVID. Now, it takes peak time of having COVID is just before COVID, being able to pass the infection on, is just before we get symptoms. So down the bottom of that line, I've got those yellow bars. That's starting off perhaps up to 6 days before we get infection. On the red line, we start having increasing amounts of COVID virus. Then at day naught, we've had COVID virus increasing in numbers for several days, and we're able to spread it before we have any symptoms at all. Then we get the symptoms, and with time, that swab test, which is NAAT, is a fancy word for nucleic acid amplification test, don't worry about it. That swab test is more likely to become positive with time, and then by the time our symptoms go, the COVID virus is going down. So just wish to show that, days from symptom onset. That's similar to influenza. COVID is the same. The red line is the actual amount of virus. And so with COVID, same as influenza, we have a peak amount of virus before, on the yellow line, is where our symptoms start. So we're most infectious, unfortunately, before we know we have any symptoms. Incidentally, the SARS virus, which was also a coronavirus, that was quite different. The SARS virus, we did not become most infectious till a week after we developed symptoms. And symptoms were always very severe with SARS virus, which is why we were able to shut down SARS virus. So it was something like 10,000 people caught it, 1,000 died, 10% death rate. That's very approximately a 10% death rate. But we're able to shut it down because everybody had severe symptoms. So they were isolated and they did not start shedding the virus and at maximum amounts until a week after they had symptoms. The major difference, and the good and the bad about COVID, the symptoms are much less than SARS virus. There's a much, much, much lower death rate or mortality rate. But because the symptoms are so much less, and often there's no symptoms, we don't know who has got it and who is spreading it the majority of the time. which is why it's unlikely to be able to shut it down easily.
Yeah.
Just in balance, just in balance with time, so that first peaks there, viral antigen and viral RNA, that's the swab test, if you like, or that's the actual virus itself, that increases for a start. And only when that's come down does that blue and red line start, and that's our antibodies in our blood. So our antibody tests is not useful at the time of somebody with infection, but they can give a good indication after they've had an infection whether they did have COVID in the past or not. So blood test does not tell us at the time. It is only after the event. So that can give us an idea if it's a good blood antibody test, and there are a lot of bad ones about, but if it's a good blood antibody test, it can let us know how many people in our community after COVID outbreaks have happened, how many in the community have got antibodies. In other words, they had caught COVID virus with or without symptoms, and thus they're likely to have immunity. But that's only after the event. Where did COVID virus come from? Keep going. Where did it come from? So ultimately, most new infectious diseases, whether it's Ebola or whether it's Zika virus, dengue, or colds, or SARS, or COVID virus, 3/4 of them, 2/3 to 3/4, came from insects and animals in the bush, and or dare I say it, farmed animals, as in chickens and chooks for influenza. As we as humans have cut down more of our bush and changed our environment worldwide, when we first learnt to grow vegetables about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago was when everything started changing. Of interest, I think anyway, there were no infectious diseases to speak of when we were hunter-gatherers. And the reason for that is people wandered through the bush in relatively small numbers, maybe pods of 10 or 20 people, relatively small numbers. We may have been living in caves or in huts, but we kept moving on to get the berries and roots and fruit from the trees. And when that had been finished, we moved on. Once we learnt to grow vegetables, and so because of small numbers, if one at the beginning, for instance, one of the 20 caught measles, it would go through the others, but then there'd be nobody else for it to go on to, because there's only a pod of 10 to 20, so it would die out. So there were no infectious diseases. Only when we learnt to grow vegetables around 10,000 years ago did we then be able to come together in villages and grow the vegetables, because we then had enough food to last us for a whole year, and then our population increased. And as the villages grew into towns and cities, we had to destroy more and more forest and change our ecosystem to grow plants and farm animals. So mosquitoes and bats and such like then had to find their own different food sources better. So mosquitoes had to learn to bite humans rather than monkeys and other primates. So in many ways, it's our whole culture and ecosystem that makes us more likely to catching these things. We know that COVID came from bats. We don't know if it came through an intermediary animal like a pangolin, which is an anteater in China, but the source of bats carry many, many different coronaviruses, just like wild waterfowl birds carry many, about 200 different influenza viruses. And only occasionally, 3 times per century, does one of the influenza viruses, 200 in waterfowl, mutate enough to get into pigs or humans, and then mutate enough to go rapidly from person to person. That only happens about 3 times per century. Once again, the cold virus came from bats, most likely. It may have come from cows, but it came from bats originally, most likely. And SARS and COVID-19 came from bats, most likely as the original source. And then it's mutated and been able to go rapidly from person to person. Where have we had the most contact with bats, or perhaps the intermediary source, was in the wet markets, most likely. In China, where part of their culture, they have lots of wet markets, as it's called. But I use the example that those wet markets passed it on to people. But when COVID-19 is in the community, we effectively, by way of analogy, we from the community are effectively the wet market. When we go into a hospital or rest home or healthcare facility that has no cases at the time, we effectively have come from the wet market, the community where it's spreading, into that facility that has no current cases. They can only get in there when we take them in, if there was none there before. So we know there's no treatment strategies essentially at the moment. There is remdesivir. It's very expensive in the United States. It's bought up all the world's supply of it, and that maybe reduces the symptoms of infection by 3 to 5 days. So prevention, we know what to do. We just need to do it. Different countries have taken different approaches to what to do about it. So in Australia, they have gone to really trying to prevent it as much as possible, maybe get rid of it, but just at the moment, it's taken off again. New Zealand has got none in the community at huge expense, I might add. Many, many businesses have had to close. Was that the right way? Or the United States is all over the place and has let it go like a tsunami through the United States. Is that a right approach when we look at it in 10 years' time? Or Sweden has tried to moderate it, get people keeping their 2 meters distant and try and let it go through the community to build up herd immunity. Nobody knows, and we will not know for 3 to 5 years, what the best approach in retrospect was. And a lot of that will depend on the vaccine, how quickly it comes, how effective it is, and how affordable it was, or in other words, how available it was. We don't know many things about COVID-19. So the question on HIV, for instance, so does that greatly reduce your chances? Those that are immunocompromised, unusually for an infection, seem to be less prone to COVID infection because it's the allergic response with COVID that's the biggest killer, the huge, massive immune response. How will this epidemic keep evolving? We don't know. The waves, now this is an important one, the waves of infection, the outbreaks, with influenza, that mutates lots. It's a very unstable virus, and we have to have a new vaccine every year to try and guess what the latest mutant strain is. And we do that from what happened in the other hemisphere. So in the southern hemisphere, we have vaccines, new influenza vaccines developed every year based on what the end of year northern hemisphere winter cases or strains of influenza were. At the end of the northern hemisphere winter, we know what the most common strains of influenza were, and we immediately, on the best guess, add those to this year's Southern Hemisphere vaccination program. And then at the end of the Southern Hemisphere, Africa and New Zealand, Australia, and South America, end of the Southern Hemisphere winter, based on what the most common strains of influenza then were, they're added into the new vaccine for the Northern Hemisphere winter and so on. Does infection give or confer immunity? And if so, for how long? In primates and monkeys that have been tested, the immunity to COVID-19, the antibodies tend to drop away after a few months and disappear after a few months. But there is more to immunity than antibodies. We have cells that can also give immunity, and they're not easily detected. They're called T cells, killer cells and such like. They're not easily detected. But regardless, COVID has only been in humans for 7 months or so. Nobody There's no good evidence to show anybody that did catch it has ever caught it again. There are one or two early papers that indicated they may, but they've now been discredited. So it looks at the moment as though when we've had COVID infection, we are unlikely to catch it again, at least within 7 months. It's not very long, but that's as long as we've had it. We don't know if that 7 months will increase to a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, until it has been amongst humans for that long. And as I said earlier, vaccines, are they safe? Are they effective? How long are they effective for? How many doses do you need? When is it best given? For what age groups does it work? All of those things. And if it had to be given by needle and syringe, there's not enough syringes in the world. There's not 8 billion syringes in the world, and there's not 8 billion needles, and there's not enough glass to make 8 billion glass vials. And so there's many, many different things to think about with vaccines. It may not come in a hurry, but we hope it will. And then treatments, it's going to be something between, it is likely we're permanently going to have COVID-19 in our communities ongoing, but we hope it may become more like an influenza, but nobody knows for certain. We may get a residual immunity to it, and the numbers will very greatly reduce once the main epidemics have gone. But at the moment, the waves that come through are primarily based on people's behaviors. And by that, I mean, when a wave is gone and it doesn't seem to be there anymore, haven't we done well? We've stamped it out in our community. Everybody relaxes, parties up large, we've beaten it. They have large parties, lots of people sharing the same area again, and it only takes one in there, one person with it, and then we get another wave. So the waves for COVID-19 mutates very roughly at 1/6 the rate of influenza. So influenza, we may expect, this is really, really, really rough guesstimate, we may have a mutated COVID enough to cause another outbreak, perhaps in 5 or 6 years' time. Could happen sooner. But in the moment, the waves are primarily seem to be based on behavior only. We know what we need to do to reduce, and it's our behavior that bring about outbreaks.
I've got questions here. I just let them keep building up.
Yes, great.
Number one is from Broach again. Women, oh yeah, hi Ben, how I get sunburn, right? So you spoke about vitamin D reducing respiratory viral infections, remember? So she has this question related to that, where you spoke about if we expose ourselves in the sun and all. So she's saying that, hi Ben, how now I get sunburn, I have to put on sunscreen when it's summer or go on holiday. Does that mean that I need to take more vitamin D supplements?
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't know what the average levels are, and I'm going to say in Africa, because it's going to vary lots between Northern Africa and Southern African regions. That's the first thing. If your shadow in the sun is shorter than you, then you may only need 10. Incidentally, you can see I'm very, very fair and I burn very, very fast in the sun. But 10 to 15 minutes, I would not burn in the sun in 10 to 15 minutes. And so we seem to need about what's called 1,000 international units per day of vitamin D. And in the summertime, we get about 20,000 units in 10 to 15 minutes if we have no sunscreen on, in 10 to 15 minutes. And I think you're unlikely to burn in 10 to 15 minutes. And we get 20,000 international units in summer. And that vitamin D has what's called a half-life of 4 to 6 weeks. So if you're to get 20,000 units in 10 to 15 minutes, in 4 weeks' time, you will be, rather than 20,000, that 20,000 that you had from the one exposure for 10 to 15 minutes will now be 10,000. You only need 1,000. Another 4 weeks later, it'll be 2,500. So it's in the lower extremes, lower latitudes, it's only late spring and winter that we do not get enough vitamin D. And then we may need, depending on where you are in Africa, you may or may not need just a pill of 1,000 international units per day just over the winter months. Now, you may be high enough latitude, near enough to the equator, you only need the 10 to 15 minutes in the sun, even in the relative winter times. And so you may not need the vitamin D supplement.
Right. She's in the UK, so it's summer over there, right?
UK is definitely the same. And if you've got a darker skin, then you have even less vitamin D. So with that half-life of 4 to 6 weeks, then by winter time, you'll not be getting enough vitamin D. So then, interestingly enough, the studies show that around 1,000 international units a day is what's required. It's hard to get enough in food. You need lots and lots of oily fish, and it's very hard to get that 1,000. But from about winter onwards, then it seems as though vitamin D, and I'm not normally a food supplement person at all, but vitamin D from about midwinter, which is when your summer dosing will have reduced down to too little because it's 4 to 6 weeks half-life, then it may be beneficial for your immunity and other things, bone density and such like too, until you're getting enough sun. When the sun is, your shadow is shorter than you, as a very rough rule of thumb. Next question.
Cool. Next question is still from Broach. Okay, so he says, in women, does hormonal changes cause raise in temperature, which might be taken as one of COVID symptoms?
Yes, it may be taken as COVID symptoms. That's one of the troubles with COVID. The symptoms can be none through to very mild, so very light temperature increase. You will know your own body better than anyone else, and so you'll know if it was the monthly cycle and you just felt the same as normal. The Swiss cheese approach would show that most likely that very slight elevation was related to your monthly cycle rather than catching COVID, but it can never be ruled out. If you have no symptoms, no temperature, we cannot rule out that you have COVID, and that is the trouble with it. Of interest, in general, men tend to be slightly more predisposed to catching COVID than women, and we don't know why. If it's same, children are less likely to catch COVID because we develop more ACE2 receptor sites as we get older. Children have less, and as we get older. But more men tend to smoke, for instance, and so it may be related to smoking that reduces our immunity with our lung cells and such like. So there are many, many unknowns at the moment about COVID-19. So is it something inherent to men that makes them more vulnerable to COVID, or is it something related to what tends to be more commonly associated with men's behaviors, things like smoking and such like? Next question, please.
Next question, is that not the same question? Hang on. In women, does hormonal changes cause increase in temperature up to 37.8 degrees?
And everyone's different. Some people it may do. As I said before, you'll know yourself if that's part of your normal cycle expectation or not. If it's not, that would increase the possibility of it being COVID or a number of other infections too, I might add.
Exactly. Now, we are all anxious. Anything with a cough, a sneeze, a runny nose, high temperature. I feel a little bit lightheaded. Everyone thinks, I think it's COVID. I sneeze in my house. My son goes, COVID-19. So it's just out there.
This is really, really important. We must remember it's fear of the unknown, but for every 100,000 deaths in the United States, it's a huge number, 100,000 deaths. That is 0.03% of their population. So absolute numbers, 100,000, sound horrific, and they are. But on a percentage term, 0.03% of the USA population is tiny. And so in perspective, we have to think of all the breast cancers, all the smoking related deaths, all the car accidents. There are millions every year. Every year there's 10 million new cases of tuberculosis and about 1.6 million deaths from TB every year, ongoing for years and years. And ongoing about 500,000 multiply resistant to antibiotics TB, which is untreatable. When you get a cough, are you petrified that it may be TB? Now, I'm not meaning to minimize COVID, but as humans, we tend to, I come back to 80% of people that get COVID seriously will be over 63. Those that are most likely to die will be in their 70s and 80s when they have those significant underlying health conditions. So when we're under 63, the fear is much, much, much greater than is rationally, if we try and be rational, which is not easy, we're emotional beings, the fear is greater than it needs to be. What's actually happened with COVID is the infection itself, the results of it have caused huge social and political disruptions.
Yeah.
They have actually been much more than the infection itself.
Yeah.
If we had all the car accident deaths, or all the smoking related deaths, or all the TB deaths, say over 6 weeks in Africa or any other country, everybody would be horrified. And we have to bear that in mind, that COVID is going through and all the media attention is on it, and somehow that is front of mind. We just need to keep the perspectives front of mind. Do what we know works. When somebody has symptoms, we will not know generally, even minor symptoms, if it was COVID or not. Assume most likely is, and try and share as little air with that person as possible. And if it's you, either isolate yourself or wear a mask. If you still have to go down and do shopping or something, wear a mask to minimize, if no one else can go for you, wear a mask to minimize your chances of spreading it, and don't stop inside and talk for too long. You'd be happier talking to somebody outside that was a smoker. You breathe less of their smoke. Even being downwind, if there was a wind, would be helpful. But we generally need at least 15 minutes with somebody sharing the same air of somebody with COVID, whether you or they have it or not, to increase the chances. Do keep perspective.
Okay. I've got Mark here asking another question as well. He says, thanks, Ben, for the detailed explanation. With your vast knowledge in the medical field, what would be your take on the situation in Africa in terms of the continent having less cases and casualties?
This is a very, very good question. Thank you. And it is interesting that it has not spread through Africa nearly as fast as other continents. And it is not known why that is. But I'm going to, and it may yet happen, but I suspect it may not. So, for instance, as was raised earlier, perhaps the large number of people, and this is just a perhaps, with HIV, because it's and so they're immunocompromised, immunosuppressed, then perhaps that unusually or surprisingly, if you like, may help confer less of an allergic type reaction or hypersensitivity cytokine storm, as it's called, that may mean there is less major response to it. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, and this one I rather like, is the good and the bad of Africa not having as much wealth and not having nearly as many medications and pills and antibiotics and such like to it means that the average African probably has more of their normal gut flora, gut microbes, or microbiome as it's called, a much more original microbiome that has not been reduced by the many, many, many medications that are grossly overused in the wealthier countries. And by having a much more rich, diverse microbiome, then that, including one particular type of hookworm called Necator americanus, which comes from humans and not from animals. So there are many, many bad hookworms, but there's one that we've had with us for as many generations as we know going back, and that seems to confer an anti-inflammatory response. So in general, in the Western world, the industrialized, wealthy world, all of these things have been treated, looked for, treated, and got rid of. And many people's gut microbiome, which is a whole new field, is known to be integrally responsible for all our immune system and many, many other physiological, neurological, mental health, all these other things. It's integrally related with them. So the average African having a richer, more diverse microbiome may be what confers less inflammatory responses. Time will tell.
Wow.
Very good question. Thank you.
No, he seems to be challenging us here. I think I'm gonna bring you some of those questions that we got through the radio station. I mean, we're gonna take this back again, Ben, if that's okay with you tonight, just so that we can reach a wider audience, because at the moment in Africa people are sleeping, and in the UK as well, and those are the people that are on my Facebook. Mainly my followers are mainly in the UK and in Africa. So what we're going to do is we're going to repeat the same session and take these questions, and I'm going to read them out. I'm going to put them on a Word document, and I'll read them out and make sure that people can get the same responses as well in case they don't come to YouTube. But I've got Mark.
Yeah, in New Zealand time, I am available tonight too. Incidentally,
you are available tonight?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, we'll make a time, and I'll put a post to make sure that people are tuned into Facebook. It'll be Facebook this time, or I'll see if there can be a way that I can tune to both. Apparently, if I want to use the same account, I have to pay something. But Mark says something here again. Hang on. I know I've got Broch.
I'm very happy for challenges too.
I'll just read Mark's one, and then I'll come back to you, Broch, if you can just hang in there. You mentioned men being of higher risk than women. You mentioned men being of higher risk than women. That will be what will be the case with transgender people. Firstly, the ones who are in transition. Secondly, the ones who have completed the transition. Wow. I wish I could answer this one for you, but I'll let you answer this.
Okay. I'd have to say, remember, COVID has only been amongst humans for 7 months. And transgender is a really small proportion of the population. And we only know that there may be a few percent difference of men over women, increased chance of men having susceptibility to COVID infection. And that is unlikely on current data to be related to their genetic differences, men and women. It's more likely to be related to their behavioral differences, for instance, smoking and such like. So that's when roughly half the case, and we'll say 60% of COVID is male and 40% may be women, but it may be closer than that. It's going to depend on different societies, whether they're smokers, non-smokers, and a whole lot of other things. Men may be out socializing more at their workplace and such like than women, depending on the social structure there. So to try and detail down to differences of transgender, there just will not be the data there for it. And to be very, very, very small. It'd take a long time to get enough data to show any accuracy and susceptibility there.
Okay, Ben. Smart response. You know what I'm gonna ask you next on behalf of all Africans and right now is like, I mean, you did answer the question. Thank you for that. His questions say that firstly, the ones who are in transition, and secondly, the ones who have completed the transition. Do we really get to a point where we say Katina is transitioning into a man? So that means her DNA, everything is now a man. Can you really confirm that 100% Katina? Everything, if we test from A to Z, you are now a man, Katina, completely. You were born Katina, the woman. Now we have transitioned you so much that every cell, every part of you, when we test it, you're now a man. Is that something that you can confirm as a medical microbiologist and scientist, or there is still some hints of
Okay, I think, and I suspect, it's not my field at all, primarily, you do
yeah.
not change the genetic makeup of a person at all by the transitioning. Now, we know there are some people whose genetic makeup is different to the average male or the average female. Their genetic makeup is different. On top of that, there's emotional and behavioral layers that we've been brought up with or that we feel. And related to that is hormones and such like as well. So part of the transition in practice is our genes are going to stay the same. And if they were a little bit mixed of male and female, then there's going to be hormonal changes, maybe hormonal supplements to change one way or the other. And then there may be surgical transitions to help the person feel more of what look with the surgery changes, look more of what they feel emotionally. Now, there's a whole lot of religious and belief and political things going within all of that mixture as well. But your actual genes will remain what you were born with. But some are not as clear cut as totally clear male or totally clear female. And within all of that um, is part of the answer, I think.
Thank you, Ben. I leave it at that. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to talk with my radio voice for about that one and just say thank you so much, Ben.
I know it's a very, very politically charged area and religiously charged area, but beliefs are important, but somewhere within there, it is genetically, it is not straightforward.
Yeah.
Whether we stay with black and white, for want of a better expression, firm views, one or the other make up you are what you're born with. but there are some people that it is not as straightforward as that. And I'd have to say, fairly or unfairly, life is often hell for them.
Thank you, Ben. You know what? You and I, we agreed to disagree about so many things, but on this one, you just answered me in such a way that I don't need to argue with you at all. So just so you know, I work with Ben, and there are times where he likes to start about what's your opening statement normally, creation versus something, and I say you need to get that
Evolution versus creation, yes. That's why I very
bond.
carefully sidestep some of it by saying several thousand years since we grew vegetables.
All right. I'll let you start the next live with that statement, and then people will hear what kind of response I give to you. But on this note, I just want to say thank you for that, because you are admitting from the scientific side of things that you are what you are born with, and some things are not clear, which is good. But from my own side of things, my perspective, you know what I would say, but that's okay. I'm gonna leave it at that. This is your platform. Next question, if you don't mind, should I move to the next one?
Yes.
Broch says, oh yeah, it's already there. Is it true that African countries are high risk? They need the vaccine more than other parts of the world. Oh, come on, baby. Now this one, I'm sorry, Ben, for calling you that, but this has been it has caused a huge growling in Africa. And I remember being quite vocal on my Facebook about this. And I remember asking you as well to say, why do they want to test the vaccines in Africa? I don't know where we are at with that. I do know that there was a lot of noise coming from America, and the one with more dollars seems to have more say about what they think COVID is, even though they are not experts in that area. So this is a question from Broch. She's saying, is it true that African countries are high risk? They need the vaccine more than other parts of the world? I'll let you answer that one.
Okay, it's a complex issue actually. On current data, just going by outbreaks, then Africa, other than perhaps South Africa, which is a different situation again, because there's more wealth there. And so I could say, if this is the reason, their microbiomes, their gut microbiomes have been treated more on average with more pills and medications and antibiotics to muck up their microbiome. But other than that, in Africa overall, it seems that COVID has affected Africa much less than what may have been expected. It's a very sociable society, and not as much wealth, not as many hospitals, healthcares, and yet so far, I'm not saying it's necessarily going to stay that way, but so far there have been remarkably small or little COVID-19 outbreaks within the population. It hasn't gone through decimating it like it has much of the rest of the world. So from that point of view, assuming and if that was to stay, then you'd say, presumably, there's less urgency for vaccine in Africa at the moment than there is in the United States, whose immune systems have been mucked up most, if this is the reason, by the most medications and overtreatments and everything else, and porous diets, most obesity, most high diabetes, etc., etc.
Yeah.
They are the most vulnerable population. On top of that, because of the wealth of the United States, which ironically has given them the obesity, the pills, and everything else, that has made them the most vulnerable, quite likely. But it also means they've put the most money into a vaccine, and they can afford to pay more than anybody else for a vaccine. There are some underlying truths there. When you test a vaccine to see if it works or not, ideally you test it amongst as many communities as possible. In those communities, where there's a lot or greatly increasing outbreaks of COVID-19. The reason for that is you want to test it amongst the most people with a control group. So say you're in a city with 100,000 people and you could see COVID was coming your way, ideally you would vaccinate 50,000 of that 100,000 and not vaccinate the other 50,000 when you're trialing the vaccine, and see how much reduction there was in COVID cases in the 50,000 that had been vaccinated compared to the 50,000 that had not. And if there were cultural differences, e.g., a microbiome difference, then you would see what those differences were in that particular community. So testing a new vaccine for a pandemic that's going on around the world, it's best to test it in every community that has increasing or large numbers of that infection, in this case COVID, because that picks up cultural differences as well. And I know and believe there have been some very bad cases of vaccines trialed in Africa that it certainly looks, in my brief overlooking of it, it's been used as a cheap out to trial it on Africans. And that's really, really bad. If that has indeed happened, and I think there's reasonably good evidence that it has at some stages, but in this case, with COVID-19, it is worldwide, and it would be best to test it in every community that had large or increasing numbers to see if it worked in that particular community for reasons that we may or may not understand why.
Well answered.
Then there's the issue of when a vaccine is available, there's whole groups with billions and billions of dollars going into it to develop vaccines. And there's another group, I know New Zealand's given money to it too, that are very definitely trying to make it as the distribution as fair as possible around the world. It may be that the United States can afford the most, pay the most, and will buy the most for themselves. But there'll be some groups where the vaccine's licensed to, when it does become available, and there's a quite promising one in Oxford at the moment, there are systems set up to try and make an appropriate number of vaccines go to the countries regardless of their underlying wealth.
I just really want to highlight something to you, and I know this might sound a little bit political, but there's a statement that you keep repeating, and it is true. It is true. That's what it looks like from when we are here in New Zealand, when we are overseas in the in the Western world, where we say South Africa is the most affected at the moment, and most of my friends, you realize that they are based in South Africa. So when we go on Facebook, you're gonna be getting a lot of questions coming from people who are in South Africa, because I got a question last night about masks to say, Katina, I'm suffocating. Okay, I'm not asking you to answer on that one, but it's because if you are caught without wearing a mask, the police will take you away. You get charged for that. But you kept mentioning something about South Africa, and I know we're going to have a day when we're going to talk about the microbiome, because people they have no idea what you're talking about right now, Ben. Just like when I first met you, I had no idea what you're going on about. What's that? What is that? Okay, so because South Africa, it is perceived as a wealthier nation, is developed. It's a developed it's the developed part of Southern Africa.
There's still lots of poverty there, but more developed.
Yeah, more developed. And I mean, if my mom is sick in Zimbabwe, I would say, please, can you send her to South Africa for more medical health? That means they have access to antibiotics, they have access to other medications that we don't have access to in Zimbabwe. It's better developed. Most parts of it are. And because of that, their microbiome, as you're going to explain it, which I don't really want to venture, it's not my baby. You have mentioned that they have more wealth, which has led to them being more exposed to the COVID-19. Hang on, Ben. I just wanted to highlight this. Do you know that Africa is very rich? Zimbabwe, as it is, we may have an inflation rate of over whatever, how many percent right now, close to 1000%. But the truth is, we are a wealthy continent, but somebody out there who thinks they are smart, they go there and steal our resources, and they go back to their continents. They use those resources, and they come back and make us appear like as if we are dumb herds, and then they come back and they keep using us. And I don't want to go deeper with that, but
I agree
we
with
are
that
very
it just
wealthy
pegs the obvious. The industrialized
continent.
world have extract right back from empires. The Romans did it. They went out and Roman Empire, and they were wealthy because they increased trade but extracted the wealth out of their countries. The United Kingdom, which had the Great Britain, which had the largest empire the world has seen, half the world, including Africa, so on, Australia, India, was in the United Kingdom. So Britain became very, very wealthy by extracting the wealth out of all those other countries. And the same thing in more recent times, well, not even more recently, in the 20th century and 21st century, the and within that there's bribery and corruption and everything else. But I agree totally, the industrialized world, thinking of all the rare earths and such like for all the technology, cell phones, computers, has been extracted out of Africa.
I know.
Absolutely no doubt about it at all. And dare I say it, the Chinese, China, I shouldn't say the Chinese, China itself politically has done lots and lots of that and is increasingly doing so as well. But all the industrialized countries have done it too. And they give a what seemingly good deal, and or a dictator has taken the money and signed the deal, which will give them a 50 or 100-year lease on an area for extracting exactly what they want. And but the end result is, and I agree with you totally, and it's tragic. The end result is that, yes, I'll put it another way, Africa is a very rich culturally and in raw materials, raw resources, very, very rich country, but it has been denied from having those. And the end result is that they have nowhere near the wealth that's given to the people that should have been there. I have absolutely no doubt of that at all.
Thank you for that, Ben. Thank you for that. I just thought I would just highlight that because obviously we are reaching more to the African. And the reason we're doing this program, you and I, is so that we can actually make people be aware of what this COVID-19 is. There's been a lot of misinformation, so much that people are becoming hopeless and helpless and feeling like there's no reason to live. There's no tomorrow, actually. They don't understand anything.
It's really, really important that positive thoughts improve our immune system. We know that for certain. Positive thoughts, even on wound healing, increase measurably the wound healing rate. So a key to this is if you're under 63 years old, you're highly unlikely or got a very low chance of dying. That's really, really important. So put that fair, most people under 63, especially in Africa, I suspect, most people are under 63. Most of the deaths come in over 70 or 80-year-olds who have significant underlying illnesses from which they would have died anyway within the next year. So they die with COVID, plus their other comorbidities, their high blood pressure, the obesity, the lung issues. They die with COVID rather than necessarily just of COVID on a percentage basis. Really, really important. We should be more concerned in reality about TB, malaria, HIV, they're going to be a lot higher mortality rate in the under 63-year-olds than COVID.
Awesome. Just one last question. We're going to take Mark's question as the last question. Not to say that I won't be welcoming questions. So people just keep bringing your questions. But what we're going to do is we are going to do the same session again this evening, New Zealand time, which will be morning time or daytime in Africa and in the UK. And the reason is just so we can have more people. I'll just give you this, then one last one. And I think you'll love this one because this is what you're trying to get me and my kids to do, and it's not working because I'm from Africa. I love my meat, So anyway, vegetarians, that's Mark Mazikana one more time. He says vegetarians and carnivores are always at odds when it comes to healthy eating. Okay. Which group of people do you think would be better off in resisting obviously COVID-19 when they are exposed to this worrying virus?
Okay. Don't forget in perspective of what I said before, that diverse eating habits and positive thoughts and good sleep and light to moderate exercise are all really important. Now, on the diet itself, I'm a scientist and I can only go by the science so far. We know from a study that was done 4 or 5 years ago now on 25,000 people around the world. So they've got a free test of the composition of their fecal flora if they also supplied every last detail of what they ate over, I think it was 2 weeks, it was 1 or 2 weeks, every last detail, plus they described their full medical history. They did those two things. They were given a free breakdown of the total composition of their fecal flora. Right. What did that study show? 25,000 people randomly picked from around the world. That study showed that regardless of whether you ate meat or not, that those people that had up to 25 different plant-based products per week, and that include even traces of pepper or other spices and things, right? They all counted towards it, or different types of lettuce and green leaves and all the rest of it. Those that had up to 25 different plant-based products a week, regardless of the meat, they had measurably increased better health outcomes than those that had less and less different variety of plant-based products per week. So it was diversity of plant-based products that seemed to have the biggest effect on better health outcomes than having lots of 2 or 3 vegetables only. If they had more than 25 plant-based products per week, then it did not seem to have any effect on their better health. It was neutral. There was no more benefits in having more than 25. Up to 25, there's an increasing benefit. The more plant-based products you had, the better. But on top of that, meat, I was born on a farm. I love meat too. But it was the 25 plant-based products up to increasingly better health outcomes up to 25.
I love meat too, Ben. I was born in Africa. I love meat. No meat.
I have less meat than I used to. And there are some studies, it's always tricky, and lots and lots of red meat may or may not be more increased bowel cancer orientated if there's a high amount of red meat. We had that particularly in New Zealand.
Well said, Ben. Positive mental health is important for our well-being. So says Brosh. She agrees with you. So you said what we eat, the diverse eating, and exercise, positive thoughts. As you always tell me before I go to bed, 3 positive thoughts, Katina, and I'm like, I got none. But anyway, the only positive thought I can have is I'm still alive. Full stop. Done. Okay. See
That's
ya.
good. That's a lot. That's a lot.
Okay.
Enjoy.
I don't know. Do you still have any more slides to go through, and then we can close after that.
No, we'll just I can got to I'll skip forward just to end up on some I'll just end up on some very light ones to end up on. So stopping the transmission, either
Yep.
isolate or breaking the chain as it's called.
Yeah.
Social distancing. So on the top, if one person were to infect 2.5 people, then after 30 days, that would be 400 or so people infected. So this is the rho value or the transmission rate. But if the rho value is less, or we exposed ourselves to less people, if we have that, then you can see the effect after 30 days. That's much fewer people affected in 30 days. Or if we isolated more and more on mask and reduced the exposure even more, look how that has a major effect. So our behavioral effects have a major reduction in spread of the infection. We can look at it another way. That's so it's easier to manage. It's likely that within 3 to 5 years, everybody on Earth will have been exposed to COVID-19. Now, if we've been vaccinated, if there's a vaccine available and it works, then we may be able to not get any symptoms, but one way or the other, we're all going to be exposed to it, that we can reduce it, slow down so our systems, hospitals don't get overloaded. So I come back to the Swiss cheese approach, just to lighten up at the end. Life has holes. It's how we get through the holes that count. So keep that
Yeah.
thinking, etc. up. Do not be the risk yourself. Follow the guidelines. Do not be the risk. You can see the person on the left with the Swiss cheese holes. Do not be the risk yourself. So just to be sensible. Positive thoughts, exercise, contact with somebody with symptoms, or you yourself have symptoms. You know what precautions to take. Just take them to reduce the spreading chances. To 8 out of 10 spreads probably come from within the home. That's where we spend the most time sharing air. I just like this one. It's Kiwi humour, but I don't know if it fits. They use the milk down the bucket there with the holes in it, Swiss cheese, to make cheese. It's called whole milk. That may not be. Hand hygiene. We don't know how important it is for COVID, but it is less important than sharing the same air. But it may well be clearly if the person on the left has coughed into their hand, it passes on to the person to away. We can look at the negatives in this world and dwell on it, and that makes us think bad thoughts, and that makes us more vulnerable. There are
Mm.
other things we've factored in, the TB, the malaria, and HIV, which are actually, in all reality, likely even larger effects to face. And we know those, we've factored those in, we should do the same with COVID. We all wish to grow old gracefully, and there is two of the unhappiest people you would say on earth. Happy anniversary, love. So we don't let yourself be in that situation. Be positive.
I'm far from it, believe me.
We want to face the future with optimism and hope. I'm sorry if I'm
Oh,
offensive,
right.
and but we want to be. They're not as vulnerable. Maybe ignorance is bliss, and children are the least. So, yep.
Oh my
Katina and
God.
I work for New Zealand Infection Prevention Control Consultancy as well, and so I hope this has been useful for you. Thanks very much, Katina, for hosting this, and I hope thank you for all the questions from the attendees. Always good to have, and I hope that's been worthwhile. Thank you.
It has actually. So thank you so much for those who've been watching. I could see people coming in and out, and I know this is quite an unusual platform for me to broadcast from, but I also want people to get used. I've got a few of my friends who say, Ketina, we're not on Facebook, and you seem to be doing so much on Facebook, but nothing on YouTube. So this is just to make people be aware that I'm going to be doing sessions on this and other things through YouTube and also through Facebook. So as for now, thank you so much, Ben, for joining us, and thank you. And I think Mark Broach, and there's quite a few other people that were on here, in and out. Sekai, I see you there. We appreciate this so much, and just the wealth of information that you have, man, like I can't even match with that. That's why I bring you to come and talk on my behalf. And thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you tonight, which is this morning in Zimbabwe and in the UK. And the reason is just so we can capture the wider audience and people can be more knowledgeable, and you can ask questions about all those. There's no question that is dumb. Anything at all, just ask some of those things that you feel like you still have questions on and you've been misinformed, and we can just educate one another and learn as we go. So God bless you guys, and I hope you've been blessed like I have. And I'm going to sign out of here, Ben. I'll see you in the behind the scenes out there. You are so in trouble.
Okay.